2008 was the first time that we had a debt crisis and interest rates hit zero since 1933. Okay, so what happens when you hit zero? The only way you would have seen what happens or what the sensible thing what to do was quantitative easing. It's the first time it happened. In response to that, the last time it happened was 1933. Okay, because what do you do when they get interest rates and they hit zero and you can't lower that? Okay, well, you could take what I'm leaving or saying. There are 5 major forces and that repeat over and over again and interact. And if you like, I'll describe them. But also you have to realize that all orders, all monetary orders, all political orders, and all geopolitical orders, in other words, systems, have broken down throughout history.
Have you ever wondered if a whole country, can actually go broke? Today on The Explainer, we're going to tackle that question by looking at America's massive national debt. But we're not going to use politics. We're going to use a powerful framework from investor Ray Dalio that shows us a pattern that's repeated all throughout history. So let's just dive right in with the number at the center of all of this.
But at least don't be ignorant, okay, about how do they break down? What happened? What happened today? Okay, debt. Okay, well, I can take you through the debt numbers. I'm sure we'll discuss the government debt numbers. But I mean, just in a nutshell, the U.S. government is spending $7 trillion a year. We're taking in $5 trillion a year. We're piling on the debt. That means you have to sell the debt. Somebody's got to buy the debt. There's a dynamic here in the mechanics. I described that in my recent books. I just want to pass along the mechanics. You could read it, you can take it or leave it as you like, but there's a mechanics here. So 5 big forces, I'm giving a summary. There's a debt cycle. In certain times, you wipe out the debts. So, for example, the new monetary order with World War II began 1945. You pretty much wipe out the debts. You start again, and then debt rises relative to incomes. So there's a debt cycle that we'll get into, I'm sure, in a minute, that I won't digress into because I want to get all 5 out before we digress into any one of them. But when debt rises relative to your income, debt service payments rise relative to your income. It squeezes out your spending, and because you have more and more that go to debt service, and you have a particular dynamic we'll get into in a minute. But there's a debt cycle. There is with that debt cycle along the way, there's usually a political, political between the left and the right. And as that cycle progresses, there are greater wealth gaps, there are greater values gaps, and we start to see populism of the left and the right become almost a war-like situation that threatens order and threatens domestic order and so on. So what we're seeing politically now has not happened in our lifetime. It's surprising to people because they haven't seen it before, okay? But it has happened. If you look at the 30s and you look around the world, it's happened repeatedly for basically the same reason. So the first is the debt money economy cycle. The second is this political cycle, left-right cycle and conflict cycle. The third is the geopolitical world order, okay? So, for example, 1945, we have a war, and then you have to have a new system, how to countries deal with each other. So there's a geopolitical cycle. They begin a new geopolitical cycle. The dominant power leads how that operates. The U.S. was the dominant power, so they had the world's reserve currency. They are dominant, and we create the multilateral world order as we know it, the system by which countries interact with each other. And that's a cycle. And we could see that system is now breaking down. It's certainly changing, okay, in ways that haven't happened in our lifetime, but happen repeatedly through history. Okay, so those 3 cycles those three orders, which are intertwined with each other, are going through those cycles. In addition, if you look at history, droughts, floods, and pandemics or acts of nature were more disruptive. They're not necessarily cyclical, or maybe they are and I don't see it. But anyway, what happens is as droughts, floods, and pandemics have killed more people than wars and have toppled more orders than the other factors combined. That's just a fact. It's measured in the book. And then number 5 as a force, big force, throughout history is man's inventiveness of better ways of doing things, particularly new technologies. And certainly that's a great force now with AI and many technologies that we're developing. And that's why, on the cover of the book and whatever, I have a chart of how it looks to me. And that chart sort of looks like I'm drawing it now. It looks something like this. That there are these cycles of that go up and down that are of economy and with that politics. The economy, we'll talk about them as being expansions and recessions, and with those have been bull markets and bear markets, and there have been 12 and a half of those since 1945. Okay, then you have these periods like the great conflict periods, the war years, the breakdowns of the system, and so on. And then you begin a new one in those cycles. Through that all, there is the advances of technology. It's not primarily cyclical because knowledge accumulates. It's not like but it doesn't go through these big cycles. There are faster rates sometimes. Usually in the booms, there are faster rates of discovery and so on. And that is literally kind of how it works, right? So now when we're going to talk about whatever you want to talk about, whether it's dad or politics or geopolitics or anything, technology, it falls under one of those categories and they're interrelated. So for example, now when we think about the debt situation, we also think about the AI and will that have an effect on productivity? So anything we're going to talk about is going to fall under one of those 5 and they're interrelated. And if we understand the patterns of history and then also what makes logical sense, then that's a good conversation. We'll see how it goes. We'll go wherever you want to go, but we will find that it'll be one of those and that they're interdependent and each one of those is progressing almost like a machine that has this logical pattern. That doesn't mean identically. That doesn't mean you should be ignorant of what's happening new and now and think about, is that different? You shouldn't be stuck into a rigid notion, but you should have that frame of reference along with whatever new information you want. And it's dead wrong to believe that, that's all doesn't matter, because what happens when countries run out of money? Okay, we can run out of money. I'll describe how we can run out of money or lose the reserve currency status. Right now, for example, money as we know it is threatened. And that money has to be a storehold of wealth. In other words, it's a medium of exchange and a storehold of wealth. Okay, so today, there's very good reason to say, is money an effective storehold of wealth? Okay, so what does that mean? So you go to history, that's happened many times. What do you do if you're a government and you face that situation? Well, let's look at what governments did when they faced that situation. So learn. How can you be against learning? The system works like the circulatory system of your body that brings nutrients in the form of buying power by credit. It brings credit, and that credit produces debt. However, when it produces that debt, if you earn enough money because of that credit, it will pay back that credit and you will have a healthy system. If it doesn't, it will build up debt and debt service payments like plaque in the arteries of your system that will squeeze out other spending. That is true for you. That's true for governments. Okay. The only difference between your finances or a company's finances or the government's finances is the government has the ability to print money to pay off those debts, and it has the ability to take money from others by taxes. But the economics work the same. So a healthy system, and you can watch it almost like a doctor watching an MRI. You can see that happening, and I'll take you through it for the U.S. government. I'll explain it, but that is now happening, and you see the debt service squeezing out other spending, and I'll take you through it in a minute. The second thing to know about that is when you run a deficit and have a lot of debt, you have to sell that debt to a buyer. So there's a supply and a demand for debt. One man's debts are another man's assets. And if they believe that that's a good storehold of wealth and they get an adequate real return, they will hold that debt and so on. If they believe that it's not only will they not buy the new debt, but they may sell the old debt. And when they sell the old debt, the selling is greater relative to the buying. And like anything, when the selling is greater relative to the buying, the price goes down and the interest rate goes up. And that's to ration debt. Okay. So what do central banks do? Okay. They print money and buy the debt like our central banks did. Okay. And they always do that. And so that's part of the mechanics. So that is the dynamic. So now let's look at the United States government. The United States government this year will spend about $7 trillion, and it will take in about $5 trillion. Okay, so it's spending 40% more than it is taking in. And because it's spent a lot more than it has taken in for a long time, it has a lot of debt. Its debt is about 6 times what it takes in every year. And it can't really cut back on expenses because some of those expenses are the things are commitments, like you have to pay off the debt with the interest rate. And the debt rollover, the debt service is huge. So there's a deficit, 7 minus 5 equals 2 trillion. Okay. 1 trillion of that is interest. That keeps building up because you build up the debt. In addition, you have to roll over $9 trillion worth of debt that's expiring. So that's 10 trillion. End of that. So I got to sell. I got to sell to replace that. And then in addition to that, so we have the 1 trillion interest, 9 trillion expiring, plus the new 2 makes 12 trillion that I have to sell. Okay. The buyers have a lot of these debt assets and are not, for various reasons, not eager to buy that debt. International buyers don't want to buy that debt because, look, who are the biggest international buyers? Chinese and Japanese, for example. Okay, we're at the brink of war, the geopolitical situation. And anyway, they've got too much and everybody's worried about it.
$36 trillion. That's the U.S. national debt. Honestly, it's a figure so big it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. But we're going to break down what it really means for the country's financial health. To help us understand it, Ray Dalio gives us this amazing analogy. Think of money and credit as the lifeblood of the economy, right? It's circulatory system. When it's flowing freely, everything's healthy. But when unproductive debt starts to build up, it's like plaque clogging the arteries. And eventually, that can lead to a massive financial heart attack. Keep that image in mind as we go through this. So where does a number like $36 trillion even come from? I mean, it doesn't just appear out of thin air. It's the result of a system that is under tremendous constant stress year in and year out. Let's look at the basic math. You know, when you boil it all down, the math behind the debt is actually pretty simple. Every single year, the US government spends around $7 trillion, but it only brings in about $5 trillion in revenue. That creates a $2 trillion gap, the deficit, and that money has to be borrowed, which just gets added to that huge pile with national debt. But here's a really important idea to get. Not all debt is bad. There's productive debt. That's like taking out a loan to build a factory that makes enough money to easily pay back the loan and then some. That's healthy. Then there's unproductive debt. That's more like using your credit card for daily expenses you can't really afford. It doesn't generate any income. And pretty soon the interest payments start eating up your budget. The problem is, a huge and growing chunk of government debt is falling into that second unproductive bucket. And the thing is, this isn't some new 21st century problem. According to Dalio, what we're seeing is a predictable script, a long-term pattern he calls the big debt cycle that has played out in empires for centuries. Now, we're not talking about the typical business cycle, you know, the recessions and recoveries you hear about on the news. No, the big debt cycle is a massive generational shift. It plays out so slowly over something like 80 years that most of us only ever experience it once. And that's exactly why it's so easy to miss the warning signs until you're deep inside it. So, this cycle follows a pretty clear path. It starts with sound money when debt is low, usually right after a big crisis like a war. Then, as confidence grows, a debt bubble starts to form, where debt grows way faster than income. Eventually that bubble pops, and that triggers a really painful period of deleveraging, where the central bank has to step in and print money, which devalues the currency in your pocket. And then finally, the system resets and it all starts over. Okay, so that's the theory, but here's the $36 trillion question. Where are we in this cycle right now? Well, according to the data, we're getting near that really dangerous part of the curve. What you might call heading for the rocks. History suggests we're in the later stages. And one of the clearest signs that you're in real trouble is when a country gets trapped in something called a death spiral. Sounds pretty bad, right? So what on earth does that actually look like? These are the big red flags. But the most critical one, the real danger sign, is when you have to start borrowing new money just to pay the interest on your old debt. That kicks off a vicious feedback loop. The more debt you have, the more expensive it is to borrow, which forces you to borrow even more, and that spiral just gets faster and faster. And we're starting to see a lot of these warning lights flicker right now. Dalio's models, which are designed to track these kinds of financial pressures, are basically screaming red alert. His long-term risk age for US debt is right now at 100%, the highest level it's ever been in the modern era. Now, that doesn't guarantee a crisis is coming tomorrow, but it's like the warning light on your dashboard blinking as brightly as it possibly can. And this really highlights the central problem. The economic issue itself isn't impossible to solve. The problem is the political paralysis. It's like everyone on the boat can see the rocks up ahead, but because they're arguing over whether to turn left or right, they can't agree to turn at all, and they just keep heading straight for disaster. So if the boat is heading for the rocks, is there any way to turn the ship? Well, even though it's politically messy, Dalio argues there is a clear, almost mechanical solution to get the country's finances back on a steady course. The first big goal is to get the annual deficit down to a manageable level. Right now, that shortfall is about 7% of the entire US economy. The target is to get that down to a much more stable 3%. So why 3%? Well, it's about confidence. A number that big tells investors your finances are out of control, while a smaller one shows you have your house in order. And the way to do it is a balanced three-part plan. No magic bullet. First, you modestly cut spending. Second, you increase tax revenue. And the third part is the real payoff. Once the market sees you're taking these steps seriously, confidence comes back. Lenders no longer demand super high interest rates. So the government's borrowing costs naturally go down, which helps close the gap even more. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. This has actually been done before. Back in the 90s, from 1991 to 1998, a mix of spending cuts and revenue increases under both Republican and Democratic leadership slashed the deficit by 5% of GDP and actually brought the US budget into a surplus. It proves that when the political will exists, it is absolutely possible. So we have the problem, and we have a playbook that has actually worked before. Which brings us to the final, and maybe the most difficult piece of the whole puzzle. At the end of the day, this is what it all comes down to. The economic solution is mechanical. You could write the plan on the back of a napkin. But the obstacle, the real roadblock, is political. The math isn't the hard part. The hard part is getting leaders to make tough choices for the country's long-term health, instead of just focusing on short-term political wins. And so, that's where we're left with this final, really big question. The historical patterns are clear. The mechanics of the debt are visible for everyone to see. So when a crisis is this predictable, who holds the responsibility to actually act before it's too late? That's what we'll all be watching for. If you found this information valuable, please hit that like button, share this video with fellow investors who might benefit, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses and market insights. We eagerly await your comments below. Let us know your thoughts and what topics you'd love for us to explore next.